Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to give everybody a few more minutes to join the stream. Good afternoon, friends. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to join. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give our friends just a few more minutes to join. We'll be started here in just a few minutes for this exciting talk. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Madeline McCauley, and I work in the Programs and Outreach Department here at Enoch Pratt Free Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn program, which Pratt hosts in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and Maryland's 4th Century Project. Before I turn things over to our partners here in just a moment, I want to point out that if you should have any questions during today's discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat feature below, and we'll address them at the end of the lecture. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our partner at the Maryland State Archives. Owen, take it away.
Thanks, Maddie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Owen Lurie. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Maryland State Archives, and I would like to welcome you to this month's Lunch and Learn lecture, which we present in partnership with the Enoch Pratt Free Library and the Maryland 4th Century Project. Our presentation today comes from author John Freese and is entitled The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of Senator Daniel B. Brewster. The Maryland State Archives holds records of permanent value to the state of Maryland and serves as the state's historical agency. These lectures are an opportunity to hear stories from Maryland's people and let us highlight the use of primary source materials and the values of archives in uncovering shared heritage. If you're interested in exploring our records, I hope that you'll come and check us out. You can contact us and schedule a research appointment on our website, msa.maryland.gov. I hope that you'll join us next month on February 8th for our next talk, when 3 Howard County residents, Marlena Giroux, Wayne Davis, and Christine Bulbul, will talk about their new book, Early Ellicott City Black History, a historic African-American church, a log cabin, and a lynching, and learn about their research that uncovered a community of Black homeowners in Ellicott City in the years before the Civil War. You can find a full list of upcoming programs, including videos of past presentations, on our website, and you can always find more programs from the Pratt Library at prattlibrary.org. And now, to introduce today's speaker, here is Bert Kumro, founding director of the Maryland 4 Centuries Project.
Thanks, Owen, and Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to another year of the Lunch and Learn lectures. With our partners, the Maryland State Archives and the Enoch Pratt Free Library, we're committed to bringing you the freshest and most interesting new work on Maryland history. Our Maryland 4 Centuries Project has been collecting Maryland stories for several years, and we have well over 100 from all over the state. It's a Maryland mosaic. They are firsts, not only for Maryland, but also for the entire nation. Some are well known, but many are not. Together, they build a profile that shows how unique and important our history has been for our shared American experience. In the upcoming 2026 250th anniversary, the mosaic pieces can open up opportunities for every county and Baltimore City to explore their own local firsts. Not all are positive, but they show that Maryland may be a small state, but it has a big history. I will be the March speaker to provide a complete rundown on how this Maryland mosaic can be a significant exploration into serious history beyond the fireworks and the political speeches for the whole state in 2026. Today's subject and speaker again show that these Lunch and Learn lectures are deep dives into Maryland history. They give us ever more understanding of where we've been, and they can be signposts to where we are going. John Freese and I have both been fortunate enough to witness the last half century of Maryland events, and I applaud John for bringing some of them to you in his volumes. Most of my interests go back as far as 4 centuries, but John has been in the center of yesterday's action. As a journalist, he has been a bureau chief in Annapolis for both UPI and the Baltimore Sun. He's also been inside state government, working on programs like Smart Growth as a staffer for governors. What I like best about his efforts is that he has applied his skills as a historian, also using his journalistic talents to bring us these several volumes. Besides recording his journey with the often controversial Smart Growth program, John has been an important contributor to autobiographies for Governor Harry Hughes and Senator Joseph Tidings. When he took on today's topic, a biography of Senator Daniel Brewster, he took on a classic story in politics. As he says, it was a rise, it was a fall, and it was a redemption. With Senator Brewster's tale, a toxic combination of factors all but destroyed a very promising career. Freese describes 3 factors in Brewster's history: addiction in his family, a World War II Marine's lifelong bout with memories of the terrible combat he went through, and branding as a quote-unquote golden boy of politics. The senator's great success turned to tragedy, and today John Freese will tell you the rest of the story. We will all benefit from John's additional task today of presenting the sources that he uncovered and the methods that he used to tell Senator Brewster's story. Please join me in welcoming John Freese.
Thank you very much, Bert. That was very, very kind of you to say. It's really good to be here today. It's an honor to be at the Maryland State Archives and to work in conjunction with the Pratt Library. So thank you all. I want to thank archivist Elaine Rice-Bachman for inviting me today, and also for senior researcher Owen Lurie for helping me prepare for this talk today. And thank all of you who are watching or listening for joining us today. I hope that at the end of my talk, you have some questions for me. If I can figure out how to move the screen. Huh?
Slide the mouse.
You want to use the mouse? Stand by. Am I? All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. Here we go. We got it up now. We were having a little technical difficulty there. Sorry. Elaine asked me to talk about my fourth book, Self-Destruction, the Rise, Fall, and Redemption of U.S. Senator Daniel B. Brewster. And while I'm going to talk a little bit about Danny Brewster's life and times, what I really want to talk about today has to do with the research I did and how I organized the research for this book. I'm not there. I got it. I got it now.
You see slide.
Okay. I'm going to give you a quick summary of Danny's life. He was born into wealth and privilege in Baltimore County horse country. It's a picture of his parents on the left on the horses. At the age of 10, Danny's father died suddenly. It was believed to be attributed to alcoholism. Danny at age 10 became the man of the house. That's a picture of Danny and his siblings on the far right. Okay, there it goes. It's just slow. Say slide. Oh, she'll do it. Okay. Sorry. We're trying to figure this out. Brewster went to prep school at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, and then went on to Princeton University. And in his freshman year, on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Brewster dropped out of Princeton and enlisted in the Marine Corps. Pretty soon they decided he was officer material, sent him to OCS, and he became a lieutenant at the age of 19. In fact, he was sent to the South Pacific as a lieutenant at the age of 19, commanding troops, and by some accounts was the youngest commissioned officer in the South Pacific during World War II. Slide. Brewster was involved in the battle to retake Guam Island, and then later was in the 3-month-long battle for Okinawa, the last major battle of World War II. It was a horrific battle, huge amount of carnage. Brewster himself was wounded 7 different times. On his second day on Okinawa on April 2nd, 1945, Brewster's platoon was ambushed and he was shot through as you can see in this picture, through his helmet. The bullet just grazed his forehead and half an inch lower, it probably would have ended his life in 1945. There were 110,000 Japanese defenders on Okinawa when the Americans arrived on April 1, 1945. And when the 3-month battle was over, there were only 10,000 Japanese defenders left. Slide. When Danny returned to Maryland after the war, he and his family got more involved in the steeplechase culture of Baltimore County. Danny met a young woman named Carol de Havinan, and they became engaged and ultimately married. This is a picture at the right of their wedding, or at their wedding. And Danny is second from the right, and on the far left of that picture is Charles Mack Mathias, his law school roommate and lifelong friend. Interesting that in later life, Danny Brewster became a U.S. Senator, and so did Mack Mathias. Slide. Brewster, as Bert mentioned earlier, soared through Maryland politics. He was elected to the House of Delegates. He was elected to the House of Representatives. He became friends of presidents. He became known as the Golden Boy of Maryland politics. In 1962, at the age of 38, Danny Brewster became a member of the United States Senate. Slide. One of the first things Danny did when he went to Washington as a senator was bring on his staff a young man from Maryland named Steny Hoyer. The other person he hired as his receptionist was the daughter of the then mayor of Baltimore. Her name was Nancy D'Alessandro, and her married name was Nancy Pelosi. They both served Brewster in the Senate, and both of them have announced that they are each running for reelection this year. That's a lot of years. While Brewster was in the Senate, it was his legislation that saved Assateague Island from being developed from shoreline to shoreline. It's a picture in the middle of Brewster taking a tour with others. You can see Louis Goldstein on the left and others before that legislation passed. But the one issue that probably, other than civil rights, that dominated Brewster's years in the Senate was the Vietnam War, which became increasingly unpopular. Brewster, however, because as a former Marine, wanted to do everything as possible to protect the troops and give them anything they needed to win in Vietnam. He became Lyndon Johnson's #1 advocate for the war in Vietnam during his years in the Senate. It's interesting that late in life, Brewster looked back on that and decided that that was the biggest mistake of his life, because he said he never asked the right questions. He never asked how America was going to extricate itself from the South Pacific. So Vietnam became a really difficult issue for him, particularly as anti-war demonstrations increased. Slide. Perhaps the biggest impact Brewster's Senate career had was on the issue of civil rights. In 1964, it was a presidential election year, and Lyndon Johnson wanted the job full time, but President Kennedy had been assassinated in November of 1963, and so because that was such fresh news, Johnson decided not to have his own name entered in primary elections. There were fewer primaries in those days, but in the few primaries that were there, rather than standing for election himself, he asked so-called favorite sons to stand in his stead. In Maryland, he asked Danny Brewster to do so, and Danny agreed to do it. But it turned out that Danny Brewster's opponent was the segregationist governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace. Very glib, difficult opponent. Danny, I think at first thought this will be a slam dunk, but as the election went on, he discovered that it was a much harder case to convince Marylanders to support civil rights than he had expected. It was a very bitter campaign. Brewster was booed. He was spat upon. His wife was threatened with her life. But at the end, Brewster prevailed. He won by more than 10 percentage points. I think he and others had hoped he'd win by even a larger margin, but it was a substantial margin, so substantial that Everett Dirksen, the Senate leader for the Republicans in those days, got together with Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic leader, and they agreed that together the Northern Democrats and the Republicans would vote for cloture to stop debate on the then pending civil rights legislation that President Johnson had submitted. That cloture vote is pictured, the actual vote is pictured in the top right of this picture. They ended the Southern filibuster, brought the legislation up for a vote, passed it, sent it to President Johnson, and President Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which arguably cleared the way for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Housing Act of 1968, I think it was. Slide. But after that election against George Wallace really, I think, shook Danny Brewster to his core. And he had already probably been drinking a bit too much, but then he really started drinking. And his alcoholism became an issue as he campaigned for reelection. But he thought that he was going to, he divorced his wife and married a ambassador's daughter named Ann Bullitt. He had been briefly engaged to Anne 24 years earlier in 1943. And he reunited with her, married her, divorced his wife, and thought that she could help him in the reelection of 1968. Brewster was really pinning his hopes on riding Lyndon Johnson's coattails. But then Lyndon Johnson suddenly dropped out of the race unexpectedly. So Brewster shifted his allegiance to Bobby Kennedy. And then Bobby Kennedy was unfortunately assassinated. So he switched to Hubert Humphrey, and Hubert Humphrey lost. And then Danny Brewster lost. And the guy Danny Brewster lost to was his old friend, Mac Mathias, who ran on a campaign slogan that said, "Reason for change." And the unstated reason was Danny's drinking. So, slide. So after Brewster lost, his wife, Anne, returned to Ireland where she had a horse farm, stud farm, and a very successful horse farm. And after a while, Danny joined her there. But Danny almost immediately, because of his drinking, was hospitalized for treatment of alcoholism. He ended up staying in Irish hospitals for the next 7 months. It was during that time that Danny learned that he had been, from the States, that he had been indicted for allegedly taking bribes while he was a U.S. Senator. As this picture showing Danny with his young son, Gary, at his side, he was, for a time, found guilty of this charge. He was found guilty of accepting an illegal gratuity without corrupt intent, whatever that means. That decision was appealed, and it was overturned on appeal, and ultimately Danny was all but vindicated. But the 6 years that his legal ordeal stretched out, it sapped him of his spirit. It really left him financially drained, And in the end, it robbed him of his good name. Slide. Finally, his brothers convinced him to go into rehab, and Danny stopped drinking. It didn't take at first, but he tried a couple times, and he finally stopped drinking. While he was in rehab, Danny met a young woman who was there in rehab. Her name was Judy Arsan. She's pictured on the left of this picture with a green top. She and Danny fell in love. After they got out of the rehab, they married. They had 3 children of their own, and Danny and Judy lived a long, happy, content, quiet life together in Baltimore County. It's really the redemption part of his life. Slide. So what I thought is people listening to this and interested in the Maryland State Archives are probably interested not only in the story, but how I researched and organized my research. So that's what I thought I'd spend the rest of the time talking about. Slide. First thing I needed to do is I needed to understand Brewster and Brewster's family. Gary Brewster, his son, had written a senior thesis at Princeton when he was there, about his father's career, and that really helped me understand it. But it was only when I looked at the family tree that I began to see the extent of his connections and his history. He goes all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt, or Benjamin Franklin, not Franklin Roosevelt, Benjamin Franklin, in his family tree. Brewster, but his family tree starts in the 12th century and goes all the way through 1957. Slide. This is a close-up of that same family tree. You can sort of see Danny Brewster's name in the top left. Slide. And this is how the family tree came out in the book itself. I think having a family tree in a book, particularly a biography, is very important to help readers understand who's related to who and what the relationships are. In the bottom left of this slide, you can see 3 notations, and that's Danny's 3 different marriages. Slide. So once I started collecting this information, and this is maybe the most important thing I did, I put together what I call a master chronology. I dumped in every bit of information about Danny Brewster I could find. I tried to make sure that I had the dates of what the event was, and that I had the source of where the information came from, and that if it might lend itself to footnote information later on, that I put that down at the same time. Brewster, as I say, lived for 83 years. My master chronology stretched from 1620 to 2016, or span of 396 years. A slide. This is a screenshot from my computer, and it shows the 7 different consecutively dated portions of my master chronology. It got so big I had to break it into pieces. Slide. And this is just 2 sample pages from the chronology. I could have picked any 2. Here you can see the dates on the left. You can see the information in the center or on the right, and you can see in some instances the footnote information or the source information in case I needed to find it later on. Slide. With the Brewster book, more than any of my previous books, I also employed the idea of sub-chronologies. These were chronologies really focused on a single issue that I knew I was either going to write an entire chapter about, or that I was going to write a large portion of a chapter about. So examples might be his second wife, Anne Bullitt, or his work on Assateague Island, he had an assistant named Jack Sullivan. I had a sub chronology about Sullivan's life and that sort of thing. What you found when you put all of that information together in such a targeted way was that you could follow patterns in the person's life. You could see whether or not his relationships changed, and if so, when they changed, and maybe why they changed. You can see if it's regarding an issue such as civil rights, whether his positions on those issues changed, and if so, in what ways and when, and what other influences there were. And lastly, you can see in terms of patterns, whether outside events affected, for instance, Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run for reelection, whether something affected the chronology. So that's what I use sub-chronologies for. Slide. Once you begin to gather all that information, you understand the general contours of your subject's life, it's time to put together an outline, what I think of as the first effort that leads eventually to a table of contents. I actually wrote my initial outline on a yellow legal pad while sitting on the beach in Delaware. And it turned out that what I put together that day in Delaware pretty much lasted to the end of the project. There were some chapter titles that were changed. There were a couple chapters got split, and a couple chapters got combined. Maybe the order of one or two chapters shifted around, but basically the basic story I had of rise, fall, and redemption stayed the same throughout. Slide. The other thing you have to start doing as soon as you gather information about your subject is start interviewing people about them. If the subject's still alive, you clearly need to interview that subject multiple times. If the subject isn't alive, you need to try to find friendly members of his family who will help you understand his life, or her life, as the case may be, and what influenced your subject, what changed with your subject, what your subject did and didn't do. When I started doing interviews, there were two things I did with every interview, and I would recommend this to you, those of you who are doing interviews and writing. The first thing is to record the interview. And the second thing, the more important thing, is to transcribe that interview yourself. I cannot emphasize how important it is to transcribe it yourself. When you hear it the second time, when you're not in the process of interviewing and trying to think, well, what's my next question going to be? But you can just listen to what the subject of the interview says. You hear it in a better, different way than you did the first time through. And it affords you because you're writing it down, it affords you the opportunity to underline, highlight, mark for more investigation later, passages that you might have missed altogether in the first time through. So that's really important. Record it and transcribe it yourself. Don't use some mechanical way to transcribe it. Slide. This is an optional idea for writers. You can do it or not do it. What I did is I purchased a writer's program. The one I used is called Scrivener. There are probably others out there on the market. Not too expensive. I use mine for both my Joe Tidings book and my Danny Brewster book. The value is, the greatest value to me was it has a terrific search function. You can search everything that you have inside Scrivener and find every reference to a certain word or phrase. You can also call up two copies of the same chapter, for example, and put them side by side and move text from one to the other and back until you get the chapter that you're trying to write. You can export or import files from between Scrivener and Word, and from Word back to Scrivener. So it's easy to move items around. So it's just an idea. It might not work for everyone, but it was very helpful to me. Slide. When you start your research, I always say begin at home. Start with the person you're writing about. I was very fortunate that Danny Brewster's son Gary had an extensive family archives in his basement. In fact, that's a picture on the bottom right of the table in his basement where I did months of work. I'd go up to Gary's house, work all day in the basement, spend the night, work all the next day, and then come back and do it again in a few weeks. Gary Brewster had original letters, personal letters. He had official papers, photographs, all sorts of things were in his archives, and it really gave me an overview of Danny Brewster's life. I even found, it's pictured up in the top right, the Croix de Guerre medal that Danny's father was awarded for his valor in World War I. Slide. Very helpful to me were historic documents. This is the picture on the right is a picture of 2 pages from Danny Brewster's handwritten war diary. This diary is 45 pages long. It stretched from November 19th, 1943 until August 23rd, 1945, ending just 8 days after the Japanese surrendered. This document was terrifically helpful. It gave me a window into what a young lieutenant was seeing in the actual brutal fighting in World War II in the South Pacific. But it also gave me a window into what a 19-year-old was thinking about in terms of his own life, and also what else was I going to say? Well, I don't know what else I was going to say, but it was. I know what the third thing that his war diary told me about was his early relationship and brief engagement to Ann Bullitt, and all of that was there. The second document that was really helpful were a stack of letters that Brewster's father had written his own parents from World War I in France. Being able to read that and read it side by side with Brewster's own war diary enabled me to write in the book comparisons of what Danny Brewster experienced in World War II and what his father experienced in World War I. And the last group of papers I found that were really interesting were at Yale University's collection for the William Christian Bullitt papers. William Christian Bullitt was the ambassador who was Ann Bullitt's father. And in those papers, I discovered not only some of the hospital records from when Danny Brewster was hospitalized in Ireland, but also plaintive love letters that Danny wrote to Ann Bullitt while he was in those hospitals. Slide. Libraries obviously are a great resource for any writer. But one thing I would say about libraries is that you can get different things from different libraries. You don't. You may have to go to several different places to fill out all the information you're looking for. For example, I went to the University of Maryland's Hornbeck Library to go through Danny Brewster's official papers. This is his papers from the Senate and from the House of Representatives. And they're all there. In fact, there's too many there. I mean, I could never get through all of them. My wife Priscilla and I went to the Sterling Memorial Library at Yale University. We went through the William Christian Bullitt papers that I just referred to. You can sit in the comfort of your own home and go into the Baltimore County Library, which has a motherlode of resources for old historic newspapers. You can get the Baltimore Sun, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other newspapers are all accessible. You can download them, and you can then read them at your leisure. I had some help from the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library in Austin, which helped me understand Brewster's relationship with Lyndon Johnson when he was in the White House. The Maryland State Archives, of course, is always helpful, particularly the Maryland Manual online, where I could find who was in different races or elections, what the results were, what descriptions of issues or descriptions of legislation that was passed, and so on. And there are other resources available too. Slides. Another resource, not to be overlooked, are books about the topics you're writing about. For me, this is a partial bibliography. The books that were most helpful to me in the Brewster book were books about World War II or about the fighting in Okinawa or the fighting for the Marines. When I started this book, I knew nothing about Okinawa other than it was an island in the South Pacific. I didn't understand its importance. I didn't know, I had no idea it was 3 months, 3-month long battle, nor did I realize it was the last great battle of World War II. But books helped me really get an appreciation for what happened there and why it happened. I also had found particularly helpful books about the civil rights fights. One that's listed here is called Bending Toward Justice. It's particularly good about civil rights. So books are very helpful to your overall cause. Slide. I'm going to end by talking about some site visits I took. We'll talk about 4 different site visits. And in each case, my wife Priscilla accompanied me. The first is to the St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. Danny went there to prep school. There's a picture of Danny playing hockey on the pond while he was a student at St. Paul's, right in the middle here. And that pond still exists on the right, although they don't play hockey on there as a team sport anymore. They play elsewhere. I was allowed to go into the dining halls, which you see on the top left, and into the chapel. Dining halls reminded me of Hogwarts, if you know that reference. Slide. The second site visit I did, Priscilla and I did along with Gary Brewster, and that was to the Maryland Hunt Cup. The Maryland Hunt Cup is perhaps the premier steeplechase race in the country, certainly in Maryland. And the majority of that race is run across Worthington Farms, which is where Danny Brewster and his wife Carol, they owned Worthington Farms. And then Gary Brewster was brought up there. You can see the race going in the distance in the middle. This was the 2019 race. I got to see the horses paraded in the paddock. We saw and experienced and enjoyed the tailgating with food and beverage before and during the race. And then we watched the race itself, which is really a very difficult race with very high timber hurdles. Slide. The third trip we took, site visit, was to Assateague Island. Storms really influenced Brewster's decision to try to protect Assateague Island. We talked to, Priscilla and I went out there and talked to 2 park rangers, and they showed us plats that had been put together in the 1950s that would have allowed for development of almost every acre of sand you could see from the ocean all the way to the bay. And the legislation to save Assateague Island prevented that kind of development, which, by the way, would have been swept away by storms by now anyway. So it was a good piece of legislation. You can see the wild horses here too. Slide. The fourth visit is Priscilla and I were on a vacation to Ireland, and we while there we took a bus ride out to an hour west of Dublin to visit Palmerstown House. This is the estate that Anne Bullitt owned and had her horse farm or stud farm. It is now, the farm is now a PGA caliber golf course, and the old manor house is now used for weddings and other kinds of receptions and events. But we got to take a tour inside and outside the main house. You can still see on the walls the bells that were once used to ring for the servants to come to your room and do whatever. At both ends of the building are inscriptions to a former viceroy of India, who this house was built for and dedicated to. And then you can see a picture of the interior hall on the top right. Slide. And with that, I'm going to stop. I hope that was of some help to you. Here are a couple websites, both the Brewster family website, my own. Information about the book is certainly online. Maddie, I'm available for any questions you may have.
Yeah. Thank you, John, so much for such a dynamic presentation. It was really fascinating to hear both about Brewster, but also about your research process. That was really great. We have a number of questions for you. Some individual wanted to know or wanted to have you talk a little bit more about Brewster's World War experience. You alluded to it a few times, but they wanted you to elaborate a little bit more.
Brewster and Anne Bullitt had been engaged, and they broke off the engagement, and Brewster went to Anne Bullitt's influential father, William Christian Bullitt, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, and convinced him to pull some strings to get him to the fighting war in the South Pacific as soon as possible. And within like a week, he was off for, I may not have the time frame right, but very quickly, he was off to the South Pacific. Brewster later told an aide when he was in the Senate that at that juncture, he didn't care whether he lived or died. Mm. And he went to the South Pacific, and when you read his war diary, he complains a lot about, we have more training, we're just sitting here waiting, I just can't wait for the next thing to happen. Well, the next thing that happened was he went to Guam and fought in the battle to reclaim Guam, which had been overtaken by the Japanese early in the war. During that battle, he was in his foxhole one night, and a Japanese soldier attacked him in the foxhole with a knife. And Gary Brewster often talks about how for the rest of his life, you can see scars, 2 or 3 scars on Danny's forearm from that knife attack that night. Fortunately, Brewster's runner was in the next foxhole and was awake, saw the attack, got his gun, and shot the attacker. Then they went back to Guadalcanal, which is where they were being trained. And the next thing they knew, they were going to go to this island called Okinawa. And on the very first day, or second day he was on the island, it was April 2nd, 1945, Brewster and his company went through a ravine to see if they could contact the Japanese. What they didn't do is they didn't check out the many coral caverns and caves that were lining this ravine for Japanese who were hiding there waiting to ambush. And they ambushed him and killed quite a number of people, including his commanding officer. And this is when Brewster was wounded through the helmet. I write in the book, and I invite people to read it, about how horrible that fighting became, how it became a no man's land with dead Japanese and dead Americans. And you couldn't even go out and move a body away because they'd shoot you for trying to move the body. And it poured rain, it was mud, and there was no way to change clothes. It was just dreadful. So there's substantial amount in the book about that.
Yeah, that sounds like a harrowing experience. Talking about your book, we had a question about where we can find, or where an individual can find your book.
Well, you can certainly find it on Amazon. In fact, there are a lot of reviews on Amazon. You can take a look at those too, and you add your own. You can get it on Barnes and Noble online, probably other mostly online booksellers. The publisher is the Apprentice House Press, which is the imprint of Loyola University of Maryland. And you can surely get it from them too.
All right, we had another question. What would you say Daniel Brewster's lasting political legacy is here in Maryland?
I think, well, let me answer it two ways. Nationally, I think his legacy is civil rights. I think that is where he really helped move the country toward the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is unbelievably important piece of legislation in our history. From Maryland's standpoint, probably his most lasting contribution was the legislation to save Assateague Island.
Okay. And then finally, we had a question. Do you have any tips or suggestions for writers who want to do this type of work for reaching out to individuals for interviews, particularly individuals who may be famous?
Well, the famous people, if you will, that I interviewed were Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer. I knew Steny Hoyer from my years as a reporter. I didn't know him well, but he was probably familiar with my name, and I certainly knew who he was. And I didn't have as much difficulty getting an interview with him. Gary Brewster, who's very active in Democratic politics in Maryland, knew Nancy Pelosi better than I did. And in fact, I don't think I knew her at all at that time. And Gary really was instrumental in helping me get the interview with Nancy Pelosi, who gave me an hour of her time, was more than happy to talk about Danny Brewster.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, John, again, for such a dynamic conversation today. And thank you to our partners at Maryland State Archives and the Maryland for Centuries Project. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. Please complete our survey that is in the chat, and we look forward to seeing you next month. So take care, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.